Well, Russia says a resetting in relations with the U.S. is impossible so long as Western sanctions remain in place. In an interview with the American TV channel CBS, Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev slammed U.S. and EU punitive measures as absolutely destructive and quote-unquote stupid. The West has imposed a series of sanctions on Russia over its alleged role in the Ukrainian crisis. On Tuesday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held talks with his American counterpart in Paris. During the negotiations, Kerry laid down a series of conditions to lift Moscow sanctions. Publisher and editor of Politics First, Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, joins us now from London to give us more insight on that story. Mr. Papadopoulos, welcome to the program. The comments made by Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev state in a way that there's no going back from this fistfight that has started with the United States. Tell us more, please.
Well, of course, Prime Minister Medvedev is absolutely correct when he says that for there to be a new round of talks between Russia and America, Washington must lift its sanctions on Russia. It would be absolutely ludicrous for Russia to enter into new talks with the Americans when the Americans have sanctions on Russia. There must be an even playing field between the two should there be a new round of talks, because otherwise the talks would be fruitless. But then the Americans, they don't enter into talks with government on a level playing field. They expect to have the advantage, and sanctions are one of the most potent weapons in America's foreign policy arsenal. From Cuba to Syria to Iran to Russia, all these countries have a number of things in common. They're strategically placed countries. They're countries which pursue independent foreign policies, and they are countries which will not bow down to the demands of Washington. So that is why the Americans have placed sanctions on Russia, and that is why the Russian government is absolutely correct to state there will be no talks with America until those American sanctions are lifted.
Mr. Papadopoulos, let's say in the hypothetical situation that some of the tensions between Russia and Ukraine are resolved. We know that the Russian president and the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Putin and Petro Poroshenko, respectively, are scheduled to hold talks on ways to probably diffuse the tensions. If that does happen, then how will the United States respond to that? Will they, as you mentioned, put more conditions out on the table to probably strong-arm Russia into a direction that they would please to get the sanctions removed?
Well, hypothetically speaking, as you say, if there is to be no more violence in Ukraine, then perhaps the Americans might lift some of the sanctions. But that's a very big if. The Americans caused the crisis in Ukraine. They have caused the violence in Ukraine. And why have they caused the crisis in Ukraine? Because the Americans are trying to encircle Russia on its western borders. People listening to this interview, all they need to do is take a map out of modern-day Europe and look on Russia's western borders. It is surrounded from the Baltic to the Black Sea by EU and NATO member states, apart from Ukraine. So to the Americans, Ukraine is the missing piece in the jigsaw, and the Americans will not give up its interest in Ukraine. So while everyone should want there to be peace in Ukraine, in a few years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, etc., it is going to explode again in Ukraine, because the Americans will not give up on its desire to bring Ukraine into NATO. So the Americans can list requirements to Russia for them to lift their sanctions. But ultimately, Russia should not bow down to any country in the world which places sanctions on it. Russia is an independent, sovereign country. It's a self-respecting country, as is Cuba, as is Iran, as is Syria, and no country in the world should be bullied, let alone by the United States of America.
Thank you very much. From London, publisher and editor of Politics First, Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, joining us here on Press TV's Top 5.